which is consideration of Business Motion 19014 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Housing Scotland Bill. I ask any member who wishes to speak to the motion to press their request to speak button, and I call on Graham Day to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member has asked to speak to the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 19014 be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed. The next item of business is Stage 3 proceedings for the Housing Scotland Bill. In dealing with the amendments, members should have the bill as amended at Stage 2, that is Scottish Parliament Bill 45A, the marshalled list, and the groupings of amendments. The division bell will sound and proceedings will be suspended for around 5 minutes for the first division of the Stage 3. The period of voting for the first division will be 30 seconds, and then thereafter I will allow a voting period of 1 minute for the first division after a debate. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak buttons or enter RTS in the chat as soon as possible after the group is called. And members should now refer to the marshalled list of amendments. So we move to Group 1, Student Tenancies and Accommodation. And I call Amendment 123 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased to begin Stage 3 consideration of the Housing Scotland Bill, and to do so, as you say, with Group 1. And taking first Amendment 105 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, this seeks to provide tenants in student residential tenancies to offer notice to quit their tenancy in specified circumstances, and the circumstances to be laid out in regulation. Amendment 372, in the name of Ross Greer, also seeks to provide for tenants to be able to quit their student residential tenancy, but with the category of tenant to be specified by regulations. Now, I agree that there will be very good reason for a student to seek to give notice to leave their tenancy, but I'm also aware that allowing this in all circumstances could have a significant impact on the management of, the investment in and the supply of student accommodation in Scotland. By specifying the circumstances in which a student can end their tenancy, as would be in the case in 105, it would assure that this could occur only where it's appropriate to do so. Because, as we can imagine, vacancies in purpose-built student accommodation can only be filled by students, something which is difficult mid-academic year. Enabling the termination of all student residential tenancies mid-year could have a substantial impact on the operation of student accommodation, potentially with the risk of higher costs and a worsening in affordability issues. We can imagine how the situation could very quickly become completely unmanageable. Amendments 372 and 388, which are consequential, while also providing for students to end their tenancy, do not provide for specific circumstances, but rather allow the ministers to specify the category of tenant. I don't think it's appropriate. I'll just finish this part, and then I'll be glad to. I don't think it's appropriate to specify that certain groups of students can end a tenancy when others, who may be in similar circumstances, are unable to do so, and I can't therefore support Ross Greer's amendment, but I will certainly take his intervention.
Ross Greer. I'm very grateful, and just for the sake of time and to clarify to the Cabinet Secretary, given that we all agree on the outcome here, I'm happy not to press my amendments and for the Green Group to support 105.
Thanks, and I thank Ross Greer for that intervention, because I too believe that Amendment 105 and the consequential 116 by Pam Duncan-Glancy present the best, most balanced approach to the issue of ending student tenancies with that duty to consult, and I therefore support 105 and 116. Amendments 123, 124 and 137 in my name. These seek to reverse amendments that were agreed at Stage 2 in relation to rent control and student tenancies. I believe it was a significant error to have agreed this in the first place. We have always been clear that student tenancies, they are not part of the mainstream private rented sector and should not be included within rent controls within this bill. The Stage 2 amendments that were brought forward have caused significant confusion and concern in the sector, and this has been reflected clearly in our engagement with student housing providers since Stage 2. I absolutely will.
Gallagher.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Does the Cabinet Secretary understand that by introducing rent controls in the way that the SNP government have done in recent years, that has left the PBSA sector as the only fruitful market for investment, and that's why the SNP government should be extremely cautious in how they proceed with rent control legislation?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first I would say the amendment that I'm moving just now is seeking to remove an erroneous Conservative amendment from stage 2, which immediately caused considerable upset and concern in the sector. So a little bit of humility there would go a long way. But I would also say that the rent controls that we're seeking to pass in legislation in this bill are evidence-led, they are locally led, they will give sufficient protection to tenants, but I've also been clear on exemptions which I know are critical for investment. But the amendments in my name will remove reference to student tenancies from Part 1 of the bill, and I would urge members to support them. Amendment 150 in the name of Maggie Chapman is very similar to Amendment 59 lodged at Stage 2 by Graham Simpson, in that it seeks to allow for student tenancies to be covered by rent control, and I simply reiterate that I don't consider these to be appropriate. Student tenancies should not be covered by rent control, and I can't support these amendments. Amendments 179 to 191 and 258 in the name of Edward Mountain are similar to his amendments brought forward at Stage 2 on this topic, and they seek to replicate the regulatory requirements in relation to rent increases in the private rental sector for student tenancies. They ultimately appear to create a rent increase process and a means by which rent increase could be challenged. The student accommodation sector, as I've already said, operates very differently from the mainstream private rented sector, and rent increases in student tenancies do not generally take place mid-tenancy, and instead they are for a fixed term duration, which is aligned to the academic year. This amendment seeks to treat student tenancies the same as the PRS in relation to restrictions on in-tenancy rent increases and doesn't take account of the inherent differences. There's also been no consultation with the sector as far as I understand it, and therefore I can't support these amendments. Amendment 220 in the name of Maggie Chapman is identical to an amendment that was considered and disagreed at Stage 2. The amendment seeks to gather additional information about non-UK students and tenancy deposits, which would, I understand, support the use of a proposed regulatory power also provided for in the amendment. As we have set out previously, there are significant practical issues with obtaining this data in the way that's proposed, and I would add that it does that without a clear remit or purpose. The tenancy deposit schemes do not currently collect information from tenants, which would enable them to establish whether the tenancy deposit is for a non-UK domiciled student, and placing a requirement on the schemes to do this would be a significant change with resource and cost implications, and therefore I can't support that amendment. Moving to Amendment 221 in the name of Edward Mountain, this would increase the maximum limit for tenancy deposits from 2 months to 3 months for international students where they are not required to provide a guarantor. Now, I understand that there can be barriers for international students to accessing the private rented sector, such as difficulty in providing a UK-based guarantor. However, I don't think that the introduction of increased deposit amount in place of the guarantor requirement will be sufficient to address some of the concerns of landlords. Indeed, you can envisage a scenario where it could arguably make matters worse for international students by requiring even larger deposits of them in order to satisfy landlords. In addition, I must flag that treating different groups of people differently on account of their national origin could amount to discrimination for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010 and Article 14 of the ECHR. I am absolutely committed to further work on guarantor support, but I can't support the formulation of these amendments. Amendment 222, in the name of Maggie Chapman, was also submitted at Stage 2 and was not agreed. It would require ministers to establish a public body through regulations to act as that guarantor for non-UK domiciled students. I can't support this amendment given the financial ongoing implications that it would necessarily create. Now, we did commit to considering how existing avenues of support could be strengthened as a more cost-effective alternative, and I would like to provide an update on this to the Chamber. My officials are carrying out a mapping exercise to increase our understanding of guarantor support, and this will help us to identify gaps in provision, the barriers to access and any possible solutions. Once completed, I'd like this to form the basis of more detailed work with local authorities, with student providers in particular, and on members of the Chamber about how we can formulate a more consistent approach, be it a national framework or guidance. And for that reason, I would ask the member not to press the amendments, but to work with me on a comprehensive, detailed piece of work. Moving to Amendments 239 in the name of Graham Simpson and Amendment 370 in Pam Duncan-Glancy's name, these seek to amend current legislation in respect of local housing strategies by making specific reference to students when local authorities are assessing housing provision and related services in their area. Amendment 370 also requires the Ministers to bring forward specific guidance on purpose-built student accommodation and for local authorities to have regard to this. Now, I understand the intent of these amendments, but I do not believe that there is need to specify this in primary legislation, because existing legislative requirements on local authorities are clear that they relate to the housing needs of all people in their area. And I can't support the introduction of legislation which would target support for one specific group over another, recognising that in meeting local housing needs, local authorities will require to balance the needs of a much fuller range of priority groups as informed by its housing need and demand assessment. Therefore, whilst I understand the intent, I can't support these amendments. Yes, I will.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the Minister for taking that intervention, and I appreciate the point she's making. But I'd maybe just ask then if the Minister could comment on the fact that, for example, in Glasgow since 2015, 28% of approvals for accommodation in Glasgow have been purpose-built student accommodation, yet only 18.5% of the city's population are students.
Cabinet Secretary.
I take absolute note of the points and the statistics that Pam Duncan-Glancy puts to me. And I don't doubt for a second that there are pressures to be worked through, but I remain committed to ensuring that all groups, including students, are appropriately reflected in local housing strategy guidance, and to supporting local authorities to consider their demographics and how they change on an ongoing and flexible basis. And I think the work that's already ongoing allows us to do that. Moving, however, to Amendment 371 in Ms Duncan-Glancy's name, this would require the publication of a purpose-built student accommodation charter. Again, I understand the intent, but can't support it. This charter covers matters including complaints which are already included in the Unipol codes, which the majority of PBSA providers are members of. These codes are regularly reviewed, enjoy the support of the sector, including NUS, and will cover issues such as standards, the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants, and the process for dispute resolution. Along with Unipol and review group members, the Scottish Government has reviewed the codes to ensure that they apply equally to Scotland and can be further amended as required. And our PBSA review recommendations are currently being progressed by the Scottish Government and review group members. So given this work is already underway, well progressed, I would ask that Ms Duncan-Glancy not to press her amendments, but to work with me and with officials and with those review group members to finalise this work, which has been a number of years in the making. And I'm trying to move as swiftly as I can through these items, Presiding Officer. I don't have long to go. But turning now to Amendments 373 and 374, and the consequential amendments in the name of Ross Greer, these would require Scottish Government to publish model terms and conditions for students and a model complaints procedure. Again, I appreciate their intention. I want to ensure that students have full information on both the terms and conditions of their accommodation contracts and details of how to make a complaint. However, similarly, I can't support these amendments. In respect of 373 and the work on terms and conditions, to ensure consistency between providers, well, this work is ongoing. Guidance on tenancy agreements, similar to the guidance provided in the private rented sector, has been drafted and is currently with all stakeholders for comment by the end of October. And following this, an information pack, including information relating to tenancy agreements and tenants' rights, will be drafted. Student representatives are currently involved in this process, and I'll take the intervention.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking the intervention. I'm glad that she mentioned that much of the work in drafting a model terms and conditions is already underway. That's why this amendment is clear that the ongoing work can be the model terms and conditions referenced by the amendment as putting the compulsion on ministers to produce. The key thing about this is that it would give ministers the power to, if they so choose at a later date, put that model terms and conditions and the model complaints procedure in the subsequent amendment on a statutory footing. Given that the work is already underway to produce these documents, why would ministers not want the power to put them on a statutory footing in the future, given that, as the minister has already acknowledged, only a majority, not all PBSA providers are signed up to the Unipol standards as they currently stand? Cabinet Secretary.
Well, twofold really. Firstly, it's not necessary. The work is well underway, it's well progressed. We have a range of experts who've been involved in the formulation of it, and the work will progress to its conclusion without a statutory underpinning. But also I would suggest, perhaps in a secondary basis, that there is a degree of flexibility that comes with guidance and a degree of rigidity that comes with primary legislation, and therefore, because it's not necessary, I wouldn't suggest that it would be right to go down that road. If I may just cover some of the concerns that I know have been raised about affordability. This is a complex issue. Affordability is very difficult to define. It will arise very differently for different students across the board. Moreover, rental costs in the PBSA, they include more than just rent. And therefore, I have, as I've made clear previously, I'm open to working with members of the Chamber, representatives from the sector and students to look at solutions on affordability for the long term. And I would particularly commit to Ross Greer and Pan Duncan Glancy, as having raised these matters with me, to work on them with that. Moving to the final amendments in this group, Presiding Officer, before allowing others to come in. 374 relates to complaints procedures for student tenants. There are, as far as I can see, having looked at the provision, already robust processes in place. However, I do accept that, as the review group did, these processes can be complicated to navigate, particularly with different processes in place for private PBSA and university halls of residence. Detailed guidance on which process to follow, who to contact and what to expect if a complaint is made is being developed and will be included in the information provided to students. And again, given the collaborative and well-developed work that's ongoing with the sector and with students, I'd ask Mr Greer not to press these amendments. So, to conclude, Presiding Officer, for these reasons, in respect of this group as a whole, I'd urge members to support my amendments 123, 124 and 137 and Pam Duncan Glancy's amendments 105 and 116, and to reject the others, and I move Amendment 123.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just to point out that if Amendment 136 in the group rent conditions and designation of rent control areas is agreed, I won't be able to call Amendment 137 as a result of a preemption. And with that, I call Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 150 and other amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I take just a wee moment at the start to thank the legislation team for all their meticulous work over many months of this bill. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and her predecessors for engagement on various issues in this. But most of all, I thank the organisations, the campaigners and activists who have got us to this point. It has, at various points over the last 4 years, felt like this day would never come. But we are here discussing the final amendments of the Housing Scotland Bill, introduced by Patrick Harvey as part of the Scottish Greens' commitment to a new deal for tenants. That's the point of this legislation, to shift the balance of power from what is a system rigged against renters to one that sees homes being for living in, not for profiteering. We have the chance to make living more affordable, healthier and happier for renters, to make renting safe and secure for those who choose to rent, as well as those who have to rent, to ensure renting is viable, non-stigmatising and a genuinely valued part of our housing system. It's for these renters that this bill exists, to tackle unchecked, soaring rents that they've been subjected to for far too long, to give them the rights that make their homes really feel like their home, to provide protections against homelessness and to give specific groups of tenants protections against rip-off rents and make housing fairer for them. And so it is with these renters in mind that the amendments I've lodged today and I speak to. My amendments 150, 220 and 222 in this group are all about better support for students. 150 gives ministers the power to subject student residential accommodation to rent controls. It doesn't mandate that there shall be those controls, but it doesn't define the terms of such rent controls, nor does it constrain the government in terms of timescale. But it sets out the important principle that students deserve the same protections as anyone else renting the roof over their head. Because we know the purpose-built student accommodation sector is getting out of control. Students in Vita Fountain Bridge in Edinburgh are being charged £554, not a month, a week. That just lines the pockets of private developers and property owners at the expense of students, at a time when we know student homelessness is on the rise. 220 and 222 are both direct asks from NUS Scotland and others, and they address a different set of issues. International students who come to Scotland to study are crucial to our HE sector. They are also important and valued members of our communities. And yet they are often the targets of unfair practices, like demands for several months' rent deposit in advance, or the requirement for a guarantor, which, given many won't have a network of support or family in Scotland, places many suitable properties way, way beyond their reach. 220 simply asks for a review of the deposits that international students are required to pay. Nothing more. Yes.
Fergus Ewing.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I wonder what the member would say to my constituent who wrote to me this week, saying that she has one flat, a tenant who hasn't paid rent for 6 months of £3,150. She's incurred mortgage and maintenance payments of nearly £2,000. She's proceeded to the first tribunal process, and by the time that is settled, with a backlog of over 3 months, the arrears are likely to be £4,800. This is not a rich person, this is an ordinary person. What advice would the Green Party give to people like that? And how can they be expected to continue to rent out properties if this is the treatment that they must suffer in Scotland?
Maggie Chapman.
Can I thank the member for that intervention, maybe? But I think what's quite clear is, and we will come on to later on in the bill, probably not today, but tomorrow or next week, specific comments about how to deal with such situations. What I'm talking about today is international student renters, and the fact that the member seeks to derail what I'm talking about, and the group of international students who are, quite frankly, left to the wolves of the private rented sector, I think speaks to his concern or lack thereof for their well-being and welfare. My amendment 220 simply asks for a review of the deposits that international students are asked for. Nothing more. I would like to have gone further, and I did go further at stage 2, to restrict the deposit demands possible. But this is, I thought, a middle ground, and I would hope that the Scottish Government recognises the value of having the information that such a review would provide. Amendment 222 requires the establishment of a guarantor for international students. We know that the vast majority of students pay their rents on time. It is not fair that a section of the student population has limited access to guarantors simply because they are not from here. We can and should be doing better to support our international students in Scotland. Presiding Officer, I'll let Ross Greer and others speak to their amendments in this group, but my final comment will be that we will not support amendments that remove students from this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 179 and other amendments in the group. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And before I start this debate, and I will remind the Chamber every time that we discuss this, of my declaration of interest, and to be perfectly clear, and so there's no dubiety, I do let houses under PRTs, they're long-term lets. I also give houses to employees as part of their employment contract. And I've been in the industry of letting houses for over 30 years. I've let houses under the 98 legislation, 2006, 2010, 2014. I'm a qualified surveyor, and I've let houses prior to coming into the Parliament on behalf of clients. So I believe I come here with some experience. So my amendments, I'm going to talk to start with amendments 179 to 191 and 258, which is a technical amendment, is to enable students to query their rents. We all know, and for those of us that have had children that go through university, the rent for the accommodation that they pay is a huge burden on them, and one that they will take through to later life. And therefore my amendment, on the request of various student bodies who approach me, was to try and give some checks and controls on these rents that are set in set student accommodation, which is why I wanted to bring them back. And I know, and the Cabinet Secretary was right, I did try and push these or these were pushed on my behalf at stage 2, but I wanted to bring them back because I wanted to make sure that students understood that this Parliament understood the pressure that they face with the rents they are charged as a result of being at university. So these amendments are attempting to do that. Probing amendments, maybe, but I do have the support of the students regarding this. Now, I'd also like to talk about Amendment 221, which is about deposits for non-domiciled students. Now, I don't take the point that Cabinet Secretary made that it was discriminatory. I mean, the fact that they're charged greater fees than anyone else, that may be viewed as discriminatory. But this is a way to try and help those students get accommodation for the simple reason that being a guarantor for somebody is a very difficult and onerous condition to take on. And it's very difficult for landlords to accept guarantors if they're out with the country. My aim of this amendment was to try and make it easier for non-domiciled students to get a flat by putting more of the rent up front. It would give the landlord more confidence, and it would mean that they wouldn't have to rely on trying to find a guarantor. So I would ask the Cabinet Secretary to consider that carefully, because it's meant to work in the favour of students, not work against them. Now, I have to say, when it comes to Maggie Chapman's amendment, having been in the industry for 30 years, I take grave exception to the characterisation that she makes as a generality of landlords. That's not my view of landlords. Maybe it's just that I work in the Highlands of Scotland and in more rural areas, but landlords are not out to make life difficult for tenants. In fact, long-term tenants for landlords are much better than short-term tenants. And I think that her characterisation does the industry a vast injustice. I would point out to Maggie Chapman that I think there are some 300,000 let properties across Scotland. And if you demonise all the landlords and you get rid of all that accommodation, it will just exasperate the housing crisis that we face in Scotland. I would, of course, take an intervention, Presiding Officer, from Ms Chapman.
Maggie Chapman.
I thank Edward Mountain for taking my intervention. Can I ask Edward Mountain what he thinks happens to properties if a landlord sells a property because they no longer wish to continue being a landlord? Does he not accept that that property is then available for other people to live in?
Well, it's a wonderful idea, Ms Chapman. Just come up to the Highlands and have a look round. I'm sure other members in this chamber, like Ms Forbes, would tell you that what happens to a lot of these houses that become available is they bought up as second homes, which doesn't help anyone in the local community find housing. So I don't take that as an argument. So, just moving on, I would just like to say that I'm not sure Amendment 222 of setting up a public body to act as a guarantor will be helpful. I think it may saddle that public body with a huge amount of debt. And bizarrely, I find myself in a position, without going through all the amendments, of agreeing with much of what Ross Greer suggests regarding tenants and the power to bring tenancies to an end, and model terms, and also regulations for the landlords to apply when it comes to student lets. And I look forward to him talking about those, because I think we're both, in a different way perhaps, trying to protect students and make sure they find getting accommodation easier in Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 105 and other amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd like to start by thanking the Cabinet Secretary for her indication that the Government will support amendments in my name 105 and 116, which create regulation to set out the circumstances in which students in residential tenancies can terminate their lease. Amendment 105, for the benefit of the Chamber, would add a new section to the bill, giving a power to Scottish ministers to set out in regulations a process for tenants in student residential tenancies to terminate their tenancy in specific circumstances and subject to specific requirements. It would require ministers to consult stakeholders before laying draft regulations, and that those regulations would be subject to the affirmative procedure. I brought these amendments because students have spoken of significant challenges with notice periods in certain circumstances, and in some cases they encounter substantial barriers to ending their tenancy early. For example, students who are on an interruption of study do not have the choice to end their lease without incurring costs or being required to find a replacement student. The same is the case for students who withdraw from their studies. For this reason, I'd welcome Parliament's support for Amendment 105 and Amendment 116, which is a consequential amendment to 105, which would amend Section 52 of the Bill to provide that regulations under the power conferred by Amendment 105 on termination of student tenancies would be subject to affirmative procedure, and I'd welcome Parliament's support for both of those amendments. Turning now to my amendments on a strategy for purpose-built student accommodation, Amendment 370. Amendment 370 would require local authorities to take account of the needs of students when preparing their local strategies. It would also place a duty on Scottish ministers to issue guidance to local authorities on the development of strategies for purpose-built student accommodation, a call supported by NUS Scotland in a motion to their conference in as far back as 2021. The guidance may include aims for the ratio of student residential tenancies to other types of tenancy, views on the role of purpose-built student accommodation within the available housing stock, approaches to engaging with landlords and tenants of student residential tenancies in decision-making, and advice on how to collect data on student residential tenancies to support decision-making. In preparing the guidance, the amendment would require ministers to consult higher education institutions, local authorities, those who represent the interests of residents who are not students, and also students' associations. Since 2015, I said earlier to the Cabinet Secretary that purpose-built student accommodations have made up 28% of approvals for accommodation across Glasgow alone. That is in spite of the fact that students make up only 18.5% of the city's population. Students and residents across all areas, cities and regions in Scotland need accommodation. However, not all students want purpose-built student accommodation, and residents need a wide range of affordable housing options available to them. The purpose of this amendment is to ensure that a more strategic approach is taken to the provision of different housing tenures in local authority areas. I'm disappointed, I have to say, to hear that the Cabinet Secretary doesn't think intervention is necessary in this space. NUS believe a strategy is needed, and local residents believe it is necessary. Without one, we could do students and others in our communities out of the service of government to provide appropriate housing for the needs of all of Scotland's people, and to take a strategic approach to doing so at a local level. So I'd ask members to support this amendment in my name, and ask the government to kindly reconsider their position when it comes to making a decision on that amendment. I turn now to my final amendment in this group, Amendment 371. Amendment 371 would require Scottish ministers to prepare a purpose-built student accommodation charter within 12 months of this Act coming into force. The charter would set out a summary of the purpose of purpose-built student accommodation, the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants under a student residential tenancy, and the process for dispute resolution between landlords and tenants under the student residential tenancy. The charter may also include, it says, standards and outcomes which landlords should aim to achieve. In preparing the charter, Scottish ministers must consult higher education institutions, local authorities, those who represent the interests of residents who are not students, and, of course, student associations. Presiding Officer, the need for this has been made clear to me and others across the Chamber, including from students and NUS Scotland, who argue, and I agree, that students can find it difficult at times to address damage, mould, pests, etc., and to get support when they need to address these issues. Many students find it difficult to individually challenge them. It's crucial, therefore, that the Government recognise the importance of all students having access to the best level of support to ensure that they have somewhere safe, comfortable, affordable and accessible to live whilst they study. And, Presiding Officer, this is why I brought these amendments. At stage 2, the Cabinet Secretary said that the Purpose-Built Student Accommodation Review Group was making specific recommendations on the development of a model, terms and conditions for the sector to support improvements in consistency of the rights that students can expect all providers to have, and that work is underway in the sector to implement that recommendation by developing tenancy agreements alongside a model complaints procedure. I welcome all of this work, and I'd be grateful for the Government if they could involve us and include us in the development as it goes forth, as the Cabinet Secretary has set out. I also welcome the work that the Cabinet Secretary set out on the Code, which of course NUS and others support. However, I have to say I disagree with the comments that action is not needed. Indeed, not all accommodation providers adhere to the Code. that alone implies that action is in fact needed. And I've often wondered about the view when ministers say it's already happening, so we don't need to legislate. Well, surely this simply means that it is indeed implementable, and that putting it on a statutory footing can do nothing other than reassure. And so I'd ask the Government to again rethink its position on this particular amendment, to reassure students and indeed the developers and providers, most of whom are doing the right thing, that the Government is on their side. My amendment would build on this ongoing work, would provide in legislation a statutory responsibility for the Charter to reaffirm these protections that good practice providers already do, and that students who are not lucky enough to live in those places have need, and I hope that members can support this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Graham Simpson to speak to Amendment 239 and other amendments in the group. Mr Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've just got one amendment in this group, and that's 239. At the moment, councils don't have to factor in the needs of students when producing local housing strategies. They don't have to mention student housing at all, and I think that's a rather bizarre situation. I propose that we rectify that at stage 2, but agree to hold off from pressing an amendment then. The then Cabinet Secretary said she would work with me on this issue, and I've discussed it with the current Cabinet Secretary, and she sympathises, but that's not translated into out-and-out support, because she sympathises with a number of my other amendments, but can't quite bring herself to back them. This amendment is an easy fix that means councils can't overlook the needs of students when writing their housing strategies, and I will be pressing it. And Pam Duncan-Glancy, as we've heard, builds on this in her Amendment 370 with a call for guidance on those strategies, and she has my support on that, as she often does, and I'll also be supporting her other amendments in this group. So can I turn to some of the other amendments in the group? Maggie Chapman raised the issue of deposits for foreign students and calls for a review. Now, that doesn't seem unreasonable to me. This was an issue that we debated at some length at stage 2. It's definitely an issue that needs to be tackled. Now, she also calls for the Scottish Government to set up a guarantors scheme. I just wonder about the cost of that. I did have sympathy with it, but one of the advantages of being in my current position is that I can change my mind during debates, and as I have already, so I'll probably not be supporting that one. I was struck by the comments of Mr Mountain, Edward Mountain. He also raised the issue of guarantors and proposed a scheme where landlords could sort of increase the level of deposit. That seems to me to be a neat solution, one that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand, so I'll be supporting that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I now call Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 372 and other amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As mentioned already, Amendments 372 and 388 have been covered, so I won't press those. Amendment 373 and the consequential 389 mandate that ministers simply publish a model terms and conditions document for student tenancies covering both private and institutional providers. It also empowers ministers to make this model T's and C's binding at a later date via regulation if they think that's necessary. Because let's be honest, there's little point in a very good quality document being produced and then disappearing onto gov.scot/publications because it's not enforceable, and those who want to forget it simply decide to do so. Voluntary guidance will be followed by the providers who are already providing a good service. The Cabinet Secretary referred to Unipol guidance. That is a voluntary accreditation scheme for PBSA providers. By definition, if a provider is not interested in good practice, they won't get accreditation and they're not bound by that guidance. Those who don't will need to be compelled to meet the standards that we expect of them. So ministers should retain the option of doing so. My amendment doesn't require ministers to do that. It simply gives them a regulation-making power, because if for no other reason, that in and of itself, the threat of a potential regulation being made would be an incentive for providers to comply now, on a voluntary basis. The Cabinet Secretary hasn't given Parliament a reason to vote against this amendment. She's argued that work is already underway. I'm glad about that. This amendment would ensure that that work has its desired effect. It does three things. It ensures that the work must be completed and the document published. It specifies that it should address affordability, and it gives ministers the power to put that model on a statutory basis in the future if they believe that is necessary. It would make that model comparable to the existing model tenancy agreement that we already have, that Parliament agreed to years ago for the private rental sector. If nothing else, retaining that option, as I said, should push these providers to accept these standards on a voluntary basis. And the Cabinet Secretary has not explained yet why the Government believes a voluntary code is sufficient. Indeed, she acknowledged that many PBSA providers don't sign up to the existing voluntary standards. A majority do, but far from all. So writing guidance for those who are already providing accommodation at a high standard seems to me like a bit of a pointless exercise. Some of the biggest providers, Vita, Student Roost, IQ, they're not signed up to Unipol, at least as far as Unipol's own website goes. So my question then is, why does a Vita tenant deserve less protection than a Unite Students tenant? Recognising that the biggest issue for student tenants is the cost, as evidenced by the campaigning on this by the NUS and student unions across Scotland, the amendment, as I said, mandates that affordability be reflected in this model terms and conditions. It doesn't specify how. Doing that in primary legislation would be too restrictive. This is an ongoing exercise. It simply says that that is one of the points that needs to be covered. I think we can all acknowledge that the likely outcome of these Stage 3 proceedings will be that PBSAs are not covered by the general rent control provisions. This is an alternative way to tackle the issue of extortionate costs in this sector, something that all parties have already acknowledged. And it comes from a frustration about the pace of delivery on reform for student tenancies. But crucially, it also delivers on a recommendation of the PBSA review group. This amendment is the best of both. It lets that ongoing work continue while retaining the power to go further in future if that is required. So I'm disappointed that the Cabinet Secretary is opposing it without specifying why she believes voluntary guidance is sufficient when we already have voluntary guidance and it has proven insufficient. That's why we're engaged in this exercise right now. So I would urge Parliament to support 373. It doesn't mandate anything beyond what's already happening. It just gives us the option of returning to it and enforcing the guidance that's going to be produced anyway if providers don't adhere to it on a voluntary basis. Amendment 374 and its consequential 390 deliver on another recommendation of the PBSA review group, recognising that a lot of student tenants feel unable to have their concerns and issues reliably addressed by their providers. They're often just simply ignored or left in limbo for months on end with little option for redress or resolution. So in a similar approach to the model terms and conditions, this amendment would require ministers to publish a model complaints procedure, i.e. the one that is already being progressed, as the Cabinet Secretary acknowledged, and it would give ministers the optional power to make compliance binding at a later date. All these amendments would require ministers to do is what they've already committed to. It would simply then give them the option of taking further action at a later point if that is necessary. A model terms and conditions and a model complaints procedure are being produced. So let's give ourselves the option of ensuring that they are actually enforced in future. That's why I'll be pressing those amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Greer. And I call briefly Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to discuss the issue of drawing purpose-built student accommodation into the rent control measures. I was a member of, I attended the committee when this was being discussed, and it was an example of how importantly clear communications from government ministers is absolutely essential to have confidence of the committee to avoid frustration that leads to decisions that are made that have a knock-on effect not only in the purpose-built student accommodation sector but also on the wider housing sector. And I'm glad that the Minister today has given absolute clarity, as did her predecessor, about what the government policy is on purpose-built student accommodation, because the trust in the government on housing was slowly being restored after quite a few rocky years. And this did knock the confidence of the sector, not just PBSA sector, but also the wider housing sector, in the direction of travel of not only the government, but also the Parliament. And having clarity and trust is essential if people who are planning to invest follow through on those investment decisions. And we saw overnight a decision by investors to put projects on hold as a result of that one vote in the committee that very day. So I'm pleased we've got clarity today that we shouldn't put purpose-built student accommodation within rent controls, because that sector is very different. It's institutionally managed, it's purpose-built, it's got wraparound services, enhanced safety and security. It's all very different. And the one thing that I've been very clear on throughout this discussion of the housing bill is that we can have the best standards in the world, but if we don't have people to build the houses, we won't have houses for people to live in. And that, not just now, just let me finish this point, because we just have to cast our mind back a couple of years ago when there was a crisis in student accommodation. I had people in St Andrews who were living in Dundee. People in Glasgow were unable to get a home near the university institution. We cannot afford to go back there. We cannot do this by ourselves. We must have the support of the private sector as well as the state providers of accommodation if we're going to deal with this housing emergency. And that's why I am in favour of having a regime that builds confidence in investors but has good standards as well for those tenants, whether they're students or private tenants as well. I'll take the intervention.
I'm grateful to Mr Wrenn for taking the intervention. As I've acknowledged already, clearly Graeme Simpson's Stage 2 amendment is going to be undone by majority today. But given Mr Rennie's last point there, can I ask him, how do the Liberal Democrats believe we can address affordability in the PBSA sector? And does he believe, like the Cabinet Secretary seems to, that we can do it on a voluntary basis, despite the fact that that's the approach we've been taking up until now that's led us to this point of unaffordability?
Willie Rennie.
I don't think the voluntary scheme has been scrutinised effectively, and actually I think the one thing that the Graeme Simpson's amendment has done is brought greater focus from the government to try and get the sector into a better position. But the one thing we must do is increase supply to deal with the price, because fundamentally we've seen with rent controls the adverse effect that that can have on the supply of housing in the wider sector, not just within students. So I'm not in favour of having a rent control regime for purpose-built student accommodation, because we know the very side effects that I've just set out today. So we'll be supporting the government amendments. We'll also be supporting Pam Duncan-Glancy in 105 and 116, but we're not in favour of the other amendments.
Thank you. Now call on the Cabinet Secretary to wind up.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the interest of time, I will be brief. I would firstly just associate myself with Willie Rennie's contribution and in particular the balance that he is seeking to strike between investment and actions to support tenants in an affordability. I agree with him entirely on that. I'm pleased to hear that members across the chamber are also going to support Pam Duncan-Glancy's amendments. These are a big step forward to facilitate the opportunity to end a tenancy in certain circumstances. Edward Mountain asked me to comment again on his 221. I'm afraid that if we extend or increase the maximum deposit, it could just make it more difficult for those who are seeking to satisfy a landlord's deposit requirements, despite the fact that I understand his intention was to make it easier. And in respect of Ross Greer's comments, I have spoken to the fact that there is expert-led work that is well advanced, and I don't require the rigidity of primary legislation to make this work. I just invite him and others to work with me on it. So I would just urge members to support my amendments, which are absolutely essential to take a very flawed amendment from Stage 2 out of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 123 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are not agreed. There will be a division, and there will be a brief pause to allow members a 5-minute pause to allow members to log in to the digital voting.